Okay, everybody, good afternoon. My name is Wayne Motts. I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at the National Civil War Museum. We want to welcome you to our second lecture for our fall lecture series here at the National Civil War Museum. We will have two more in this room next week at 1 o'clock and the week after at 1 o'clock as well. And I'll mention those after Gene completes his presentation. So the folks that are involved here at the National Civil War Museum, just let me say, we have a lot of sponsors. They're listed over here on the panel. We wouldn't be able to have these types of presentations or educational activities without all our sponsors. So I just want to recognize them here today. I also want to say that we have a governing board here at the National Civil War Museum of 21 people. These folks are very busy people. You know what they always say, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person. And that's sort of how I feel about the board here at the National Civil War Museum. They volunteer their time, they don't get any compensation, and many of these folks are professional business people with the community, not only here in South Central Pennsylvania, but elsewhere. They could be doing a lot of things with their time, and they choose to come here on behalf of the museum and advance the educational mission of this facility. And Gene Barr is one of those today. Gene is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Pennsylvania Business and Industry Chamber, correct?
Chamber of Business and Industry.
Chamber of Business and Industry. There. Gene has had over 12 years with a Fortune 100 company. He spent more than 40 years in doing the type of governmental affairs work. His office is right here downtown. More importantly, he is a Civil War scholar in his own right, knows a tremendous amount about the American Civil War. So when he comes to the museum, he and we often have a lot of great talks among the board members that are here. And he is a member of the board of directors here at the National Civil War Museum. Recently, he did come out with a Civil War Captain and His Lady, published by Savas Beatty Publishing in California. Now, what's very unique about this, at least I think, as a Civil War historian, is that Gene has both sides of this presentation. Letters from the soldier, letters from the fiance and future wife as well. So you get both. Usually, when you do research on the Civil War, you only get one side of these letters. And what's really interesting about this is you get a picture of not only the front, but you get the home front and everything else related to it that Gene has put together in this book. After Gene is talking here, we will have him outside at a table signing. So if you want to pick up a copy of the book, it's $32.95. The proceeds today benefit the National Civil War Museum, and Gene will sign it and personalize it to you. So without any further ado, I want to welcome my friend, our board of director here at the National Civil War Museum, author and historian par extraordinaire, Gene Barr.
I always figure it kind of doesn't matter how much I know because I'm never going to surpass Wayne. As I mentioned earlier, we do have the same publisher. Our books have been published by Savas Beatty. And Wayne, how many have you done at this point? How many books have you had?
I've got two. Co-author of the one that's Savas Beatty, and I'm one of them.
Wayne, for those of you who don't know, is one of, not the most preeminent scholar on Armistead. So picked up his book as well. And I appreciate the fact that got the opportunity, and you guys have all come out, foregone college football for a day, etc., or whatever else is going on. But as I said in one of my social media tweets, it's at least air conditioned in here, so we can go through all that as well. As Wayne said, he described a little bit about the book, and the name of the book is A Civil War Captain and His Lady, subtitled Love, Courtship, and Combat from Fort Donelson through the Vicksburg Campaign. Now, the practice of trying to select a title is interesting. This is my first book. It only took me 16 years. We've been a little busy over that period of time. I've got a kind of a rough job today, and the job I have is to give you enough stuff to get you interested, but not too much stuff that you think that you heard all the good stuff that you don't need to buy the book. So it's kind of walking a fine line here as well. Coming up with the caption was interesting. The story really is kind of largely, as Wayne noted, a story of a courtship, a Civil War courtship. Kind of one challenge I had with this is trying to go through, find a publisher, find an agent first, which wasn't successful. It's the old catch-22. Nobody wants to represent you until you're published, but you can't get published until you're represented. So you're kind of caught in that mix. But part of this challenge as well, in addition to the fact that the basic structure of the book is this series of letters between an Illinois captain, Irish immigrant, 27-year-old Josiah Moore, and a woman he meets while he's in camp in Peoria, 19-year-old Jennie, Lindsay, who is the daughter of one of Peoria's most notable community figures, and we'll talk a little bit about him as well. But the challenge with that is books about the Western theater don't quite sell as much, do as well, particularly here. I mean, Wayne's got a phenomenal book on Pickett's Charge, and as I said, it's one of the best releases on that particular incident. But people in this area love reading about Gettysburg, as they should. Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, the Wilderness, Manassas, all of those things do well. Challenge is that this part of the book really deals with the Western theater. For those, I know most of you probably know, but the Western theater doesn't mean California, Washington, and Oregon. The Western theater means everything west, largely of the Pennsylvania border. So Ohio troops, Illinois troops, Indiana troops were called Western troops, as strange as it sounds. And the battles like Shiloh, Donelson, and Vicksburg were part of the Western Campaign. So there's a little bit less interest. Let's put it this way, there's more interest in the Eastern theater than the Western. So I thought about, how do I market this thing? So I kind of talked to the publisher. I said, you know, maybe because all these books about Lincoln go well and Gettysburg go well, what if we do the book, and it's kind of in little letters, a story about a man from Illinois who was not Lincoln, and who fought in a bunch of battles, but not Gettysburg. And I wondered how that would go if we did that as a title. The publisher wasn't too keen on that one. Knowing, however, that it is a book that is kind of it is a romance, it is a true story, and this is all true, this is all complete nonfiction, that it was about this relationship between this man and woman. I asked him if he'd be interested in calling it 50 Shades of Blue and Gray, but he wasn't really interested in that one as well, so we didn't get too far with that. Anyway, that is the title. This is a picture of the book. Wayne held up the book. This is the gratuitous picture of the dog. Yes, it's an absolute pandering picture to the audience. This is Henry. Henry is our dog we got 2 years ago. My kids told me Henry has to be in the slides, because when I wrote the book, Henry would come down and lay in the same room where I did all my work, so my kids said, Dad, you got to put Henry in the slide. So yes, it's a complete pandering picture to the dog lovers in the audience. Yes, absolutely. So that's Henry. Okay, this is Jenny Lindsay. As you can tell from looking at her, she's pretty well to do. 19 years old, the picture was taken about that time, I believe. She might have been 20. Her father was born not too far from here in McConnellsburg. She was born in Peoria, but as I said, she's 19 years old. You can see pretty well dressed, upper middle class in Peoria. This is a picture of Josiah Moore. As I mentioned, Josiah Moore, 27-year-old Irish immigrant, Northern Ireland, came here when he was an infant, actually came through Pennsylvania, and he went for a time at Westminster College, if you're familiar with that, in the western part of Pennsylvania. It was actually Westminster Prep at the time. This is an early war picture of him, the earliest one that I've seen, 1861, thereabouts. So he enlisted in the first flush of war, there in April of 1861. He signed up for complete story, a very interesting story about how he wound up enlisting is laid out in the book. And I talk a little bit about why he did, or why he might have, in kind of that first flush of war when everything is happening and all these guys are rushing in to fulfill Lincoln's call for volunteers. So you can see he's a bit older. He was also 6'4", which at that time was a really tall person, when the average height of a man in the 1860s was about 5'7", 5'8". So he, in many cases, towered over his man. I've literally gone through. I have the original muster-in sheet for the 17th Illinois Company F, which he was the captain of. And the muster sheet is almost the size of this panel here. It's huge, about 2/3 the size of that panel. And I kind of went down and counted where they were from, where they were, because this muster-in sheet has the name that they all signed, their description, their height, where they were born, what their occupation is. And interestingly, he stated that his nativity was Illinois, not Ireland, which is an interesting point if you think about it, because immigrants of the time, and we have tremendous discussion today over immigration in this country, and there's a lot of resentment against immigrants here. You transfer that back and you read about the 1860 period, it was Irish Catholics. And he was not Catholic, but he was from Ireland, and he was, I suspect, concerned about coming in as captain and having his men think that they're being led by this immigrant. So he stated he was born in Illinois, when in fact he was not. The other interesting thing is there were a lot of guys who were 5'11", 6 foot, 6'1" in his company, so it was kind of a tall company, which was interesting and a little bit out of the ordinary. And as I scanned this whole list, and there were about 110 men who listed themselves on the muster-in sheet, I saw a name, James Earp, and I wondered, gee, I wonder, that's a familiar name. James Earp, I found out, was the older brother of Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois. He went to Monmouth College, which is in that town, and I've been to the town. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I did a tour out there, and I just came back. Wyatt Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois. His older brother, James, enlisted in Company F, 17th Illinois. So I did a little bit more research on James Earp. And how many of you have seen the movie Tombstone, the Kurt Russell movie about the shoot at the OK Corral? There's a Kevin Costner movie about the Earp family as well. The Kurt Russell movie never mentions James Earp. The Kevin Costner film does mention James Earp. And what happened to James was, first battle of the war, the Battle of Fredericktown, Missouri in 1861, a good bit of the company was sick for that battle, including Josiah. James Earp went out. James Earp was shot through the shoulder by a mini ball, was discharged a few months later because he could never lift his arm above. So Kurt Russell's movie never mentions James Earp. Costner's movie does. However, James would stay behind and manage the bar, as you might have seen from the Costner movie. So it was interesting to find James Earp as part of that as well. So these are the two. They meet in camp in Peoria in May of 1861. The book is into a significant amount of detail, and it allows me to, as it does, what I did with these letters. I always knew that I didn't want to just put the letters in and let the reader figure out what Josiah was doing in Fort Donelson or what Jenny was doing back in Peoria. I knew I wanted to put them in context. But the other thing that I was able to do with the letters was use the letters to look at 1861 to 65 life through the prism of these letters. How did they feel about religion? Because they're both very religious people, and they talked a lot about religion. Why did he, if I could figure that out, why did he enlist? What made men enlist? And I get into discussion generally about what that was, and despite what many people think, it wasn't to end slavery for most of these guys, which we'll talk about a little bit towards the end. Obviously talk a little bit about the battles he fought in, and with what I found in his letters as well as other research, I did all the research. One of the reasons it took 16 years was a lot of unpublished material about Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. And again, for me, grew up in Philadelphia, lived for a little while in Georgia, so I got some exposure to the Western theater, but like most people around here, more exposure to Eastern. Had my eyes open because I had never been to Vicksburg before I did this research. Found some fascinating stuff on Donelson and Shiloh, but also was able to look at a lot of new information about those battles as well. So the letters gave me the ability to look at these two letters. Well, one of the things that it gave me that I had to think a little bit about was, how did they meet? And meeting somebody in 1861 America was distinctly different. If you're a male and you saw a female who you might want to get to know, you could not walk up to her and say, "Hi, my name is Josiah." That was considered rude and completely out of social norms. You had to find somebody who knew that young woman, who you knew, who could introduce you to her to make that connection. Everything was quite ritualized. In fact, you couldn't simply just send her a letter either. You had to ask her, "May I correspond with you?" At which point she would agree, and they obviously did, because in this case I have 75 letters from the two of them over the wartime period. Now at this point, and it's a question that's come up in every talk I've given, how did you get the letters? And it's almost always the first question people ask me. So I will tell you that story, and it is in the book in more detail, but what the heck, we got time, I'll give you the full version. I used to work with a guy in one of my previous jobs. He worked in the Florida office of API where I worked. I was in the Pennsylvania office. And he called me one day. He said, "Hey, look, I inherited a bunch of stuff. I inherited a cabin. It was an unheated cabin on a lake in Wisconsin, Lake George, I believe it's called. And he said, I found this stuff, and a guy in Harrisburg is going to buy it. And I don't know him, and he doesn't know me. So could you be the go-between?" And at this point, I worked for a law firm in Harrisburg, even though I'm not a lawyer. Don't worry, you guys get concerned about that. Just don't tell the people at the law firm I'm not a lawyer. They never caught on. I'm kidding about So he called me and he said, could you be the go-between? So it was railroad memorabilia. It was a whole set of railroad passes, I believe, for the year 1887 for every railroad I'd ever heard of, and many of which I hadn't. So we did that, and he called me later, thanked me for that, and he said, hey, I've got some letters and I think they're Civil War. Will you help me get rid of them? So I said, sure, send them up, let me take a look at them. So I looked at them and realized indeed they were from the Civil War. And along with that, there were some photographs, things called carte de visites. Most of you in this room know what carte de visites or CDVs are. For those of you who don't, it's a photograph, looks something like that. That is not a CDV, but would look like that on an index, on a card about the size of an index card. On the back of it, in many cases, would be the photographers. You can tell where it was taken. And I'll show you some examples of CDV, and the book itself has a number of CDVs that I acquired as part of the collection, or that I had permission to use. Do you have one up there?
Oh, we did, Gene, I was looking, but I
Anyway,
don't see it.
You'll see some in here, and you'll see some in the book too, and some that I took from the, I shouldn't say took, that sounds horrible, that I got permission to use from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, which is a phenomenal facility if you've not been out there. So there were some photographs that came with it. So I took them and I looked at them, and this was literally 2000, which is when this whole journey started. So I took the letters in, and there were wartime letters. There were from both, as well as post-war letters. So there's a spoiler alert, you know, Josiah survived the war. As well, and included in that were a couple letters, one from, which I'll talk about momentarily, one from Josiah to Jenny's father, and another interesting one from Jenny's cousin and a neighbor to Josiah, which I'll briefly touch on as well. And so I looked at all these and I said, well, geez, I don't know what, I didn't have a great handle on what they're worth. There was a lot there. So I looked at them and looked at them closely enough to know what I had, but I took them to a couple of dealers and said, hey, I got a friend who wants to get rid of these. And two of the dealers said, you have to leave them with me. I'll look at them all and then I'll give you a price. Well, I couldn't, they're not my property. If I left them and they disappeared or they were in a fire or they were lost, that's all on me, so I couldn't do it. I had one dealer I talked to who said, all right, he said, I don't want any of the post-war letters. And I don't want any of the woman's letters. He said, I will buy all of the soldier letters from you for $15 a piece, and why don't you keep 5 and send the owner 10? Well, one, I thought that was a low ball. Two, I wasn't comfortable taking that amount of money. But because I had seen them, I said, if we do that, and I knew what he would do, he would take the best letters, the ones that say like from the battle lines of Vicksburg, and he would sell those for a good amount of money. And I also knew that once we did that, the whole story would be gone. You would never put this back together again. So I was torn because my daughter was starting college the next year, but I made the decision just to go ahead and do it because I just couldn't in good conscience let these go. Because the letters are phenomenal. They're both well educated. They are both well written. And you look at that and you realize that this, as I mentioned, this is a Civil War courtship done through letters. And most of them were between the two of them. As I mentioned, there's a couple of other ones. One of them was rather interesting. One of them was, and it was like being back in junior high. Josiah left Peoria in 1861. They moved around. They went through Missouri. They went through, I guess Bird's Point is down in northern Kentucky. So they moved all around while they were getting positioned, chasing Confederates early in the war, etc. And so some time went by. He had been sick. As I mentioned, he missed their first battle, so some time had gone by, and he hadn't written to Jenny in a while, which wasn't uncommon because a lot of times men in the field wouldn't write home and say, I'm sick, because people would get worried because illness killed 3 times as many men as battle wounds. So people at home would go, oh, geez, who knows what it is? And in fact, there are instances, even in the camp of the 17th, where measles would hit the camp and kill hundreds of men. Throughout all those camps, there were more than one regiment. So at one point, Jenny's cousin writes to Josiah and basically like this junior high type thing. Don't you like Jenny anymore? How come you're not writing to her? And it's this great junior high, please write to Jenny. She's really worried. So he immediately apologizes and writes back in. The other one was from from Josiah to her father. Now Jenny's father, which I'll show you a picture of here shortly, was an interesting character as well. He was, and this is part of the other stuff that fascinates me because as Wayne mentioned, my life has been in politics. her father was heavily engaged in political work in Illinois. In fact, he was a member of the Whig Party, for those of you who don't know, WHIG, which was the predecessor to the Republicans. He was a Whig turned Republican, was a member of the Illinois State House as a Republican, and then became a Democrat, ran for the Illinois State Senate in 1862, was elected to the Illinois State Senate as a Democrat, and quickly became one of the most notorious, what's called Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, in Illinois. Copperheads were not well viewed by the men in the field, nor by many people in the North. There were people who believed that we ought to put the Union back together, let them keep slavery, let's just figure out what we need to do to pull this back together and stop the fighting, and let's end the war. So that was Jenny's dad. And in fact, there was a great quote that I had to put in the book, and I'll tell you, it was after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. John Lindsay, her dad, had been sworn into office, and I believe it was in January or February of 1863, on the floor of the Illinois State Senate, he took on Abraham Lincoln and said, if hell was boiled down to the consistency of liquid fire and poured down the throat of Abraham Lincoln, it would altogether be too good for him. So, do you think that Lindsay didn't really like Abraham Lincoln that much? So, interesting guy. Let's go through a little bit more here. This was another thing. I would get periodic calls from the guy who I bought the collection from. And he would say, hey, I found a few more pictures. And I would say, yep, send them up. So I would buy, and there were all kinds of CDVs, some of them identified, actually most of them identified, from people in Josiah's unit as well as others that he served with. So he called me, this guy called me, it was actually a couple of years after I bought the collection, and he said, I found some buttons and numbers. I went, send them. And they were in this little wooden matchbox on this unheated lake, this cabin in Wisconsin. These are, and it's really hard to tell here, but these were typically done by men to represent their unit. So 17th Illinois, and he was, in fact, if you recall from one of the previous ones, Josiah had a forge cap on his lap. These would be at the ends of the band on the forge cap. Now the 17, usually the numbers were like a stamped brass. They were kind of a cheap stamped brass. These are, and I still have to get them tested, they may be silver. It's like a braided silver. They're really nice. Of course, they've got a patina on them now. But as I sat and held these in my hand, I thought about the fact that he went through the Battle of Shiloh wearing that somewhere on his cap. So it gives you a real perspective about some of those kinds of things. This is Josiah's home in Hanover, Illinois, and it's a little tough to see. And I even tried to visit it when I was there. I had the address, it was written on the back. This came with the collection as well. But you see somebody right there, that's Josiah's dad. Back in there, it's hard to see, but if you get up to it, you can. Josiah's mother is back here. And just recently, even though it wasn't pointed out to me, it looks like one of Josiah's brothers is here. So this house supposedly is still there. When I was in Illinois 8 years ago, I called the number associated with this, did a white pages search. I couldn't get them to answer the phone. I just wanted to go out and see the house, but I had no luck and I didn't have any time the last time I was there a couple weeks ago. This is, after these guys all enlisted, this is where they went. This is the square in Monmouth, Illinois, little town of Monmouth. It doesn't look that much different. It's still a little tiny town. This is the old courthouse. It's no longer there. There's a brand new courthouse with a Civil War monument right about there. After they were sworn, after they enlisted, they went over to this building, Claycomb Hall, which is still there, where they heard, according to one of the men who was there, patriotic speeches and songs. Now that's still there. These buildings are all gone, but the square looks largely the same. Kind of neat to see. This is one of the men who Josiah served with. His name was Robert L. Duncan. He became sergeant of Company F, 17th Illinois. He was also from Monmouth and a student at Monmouth College as well. About 20 men from the company were students at Monmouth. Duncan kept the company log. One of the most important things I found was, and someone fortunately had transcribed that, a guy who was very helpful to me who lives in Monmouth, who provided me his transcribed version of the log, which gave a lot of very interesting stuff. His descriptions after Shiloh, after Donelson, during Vicksburg when they were in siege conditions. Robert Duncan's life after the Civil War literally reads like a soap opera. You have to take a look at it. Duncan must have been a really interesting character. He was wounded in the hand at Shiloh as well. And again, this is the CDV I told you about. They usually have a border like that. And let me flip back.
back, Gene?
Yeah.
Let me
Do
get
that.
back to the,
Something hit there.
sorry, yeah, let me get it for you. From current slide,
Yeah.
how's that?
That's fine, that's good. There we go. This is another CDV, which I'll tell you about in a minute. You can tell they're kind of lined like that on the back of it, usually is a photographer's name. This is Abraham or Abram Ryan, another guy. He was from Peoria. He was in, I believe, Company A to start the war. He became the adjutant very quickly after. This picture was taken, he was colonel of the 3rd Arkansas Cavalry USCTs. This was taken in Arkansas. As you can see, the coat, for those of you who follow that, is obviously a custom coat or some type of cape on there. Abram Ryan was an interesting guy as well. Based on some of the letters that I have, I think, and I'm speculating, I think that maybe he was the guy who introduced Josiah to Jenny, which is kind of fun to find out, but even more interesting because what I believe is, when I read the letters, I think Abraham Ryan viewed himself as a suitor to Jenny as well, because you would see these interesting back and forth where Jenny would say to Josiah, Abraham Ryan got to come home, how come you can't get to come home? And then there are other things about, Josiah would say, I thought about writing a letter with Ryan and I together to you, but I thought better of it. So all kinds of little interesting intrigues where it looks like Ryan was a suitor as well. He was a friend of the Lindsay family, which is why I think he perhaps made that introduction. He wrote the after-battle report that wound up in the official records for the 17th at Shiloh, and Josiah is mentioned for his, I believe, conspicuous bravery at the Battle of Shiloh. This is another picture. It was taken in Peoria, which goes to show that the Union wore blue and the Confederates wore gray was absolutely wrong. This is a Union enlisted man who looks to be wearing what's probably a gray coat and dark blue pants. In fact, there's a guy whose writings I found name was Frank Peets. Peets became major of the 17th when they arrived in Peoria. He was from Rockford, Illinois. He said, I've never seen more variety of coats, pants, and hats anywhere in my life. So they brought everything, as those of you know, particularly at the beginning of the war. I love this picture. This is a picture of the 17th at the battle, after the Battle of Vicksburg during occupation. We couldn't use it for the photo for the book because we couldn't find the original anywhere. It was in the, I'm trying to think of the name of the book. Jack Davis did it. It was credited to the National Archives or something like, it's disappeared. Nobody can find it anymore. But it's a perfect picture of guys in the field after 2 years. For those of you who are more familiar with Eastern headgear, with forage caps, etc., I don't see a single forage cap in here. They're all wearing what are called slouch hats, look a little bit like cowboy hats. These are guys who have been through already 2.5 years of war. I don't know where Josiah is. I've tried to look, and I guess somebody's ordering from Amazon on us at this point. I don't know. Okay, that's interesting. Just hit OK, I guess. There we go. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, thanks.
So there's the.
That's great, we'll keep you around.
There's the battle flags. And I was in Illinois recently in Springfield, and I was given a talk to the Illinois Military History Museum. And after I was done, it's a National Guard facility. The guy said, "You want to go see the battle flags of the 17th?" I went, "Yeah." So we went over, and there were both the national and the state, and I saw those two flags. They're still there, and I got to touch the edges of it as well as touch the staff on which they were. It's a great picture. We couldn't find it. I even went to the publisher to see if there's any way we could use it. Legally, we can use it because my understanding is it's in the public domain, but it wasn't considered to be good enough quality to put in the book, unfortunately. This is a picture of the infamous John Lindsay. This is taken, I believe, about 1880. John Lindsay loved dogs. I've counted there's like 4 of them in there. This is, as I mentioned, well after the war. It's the only picture I could find of John Lindsay. There's one that the family has, which I'll tell you about in a minute, but this is a late war. Lindsay, after the Civil War, he moderated his stance a bit. Of course, when you're on the losing side, that's what will happen politically. He lost his hearing. He was a lawyer in Peoria, lost his hearing, moved to Nebraska with his other son, who was also a Civil War veteran, 77th Illinois, died in Nebraska and never came back, and he's buried in Nebraska. That's the infamous John Lindsay. The house, we think, is still there in Peoria. I'm trying to think the name of the road, but it's still there. This is a picture of Josiah after 3 years. I showed you the other one. This was taken, allegedly, according to the family, on his honeymoon in Minnesota. I think the back of it says St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, I'm going to show you a comparison. That's after 3 years, that's when he left. And there's the forage cap there. Haggard, thin, he suffered a lot of illness, and before he died, he had applied for a pension based on living outside at the during the siege of Vicksburg. These guys were outside for about 38, 39 days with no shelter whatsoever, in lines, on skirmish lines, sniping. So that's what 3 years will do to you. Nope. For some reason it just hits.
Which way you want to go, Gene?
Backwards.
To which side?
Keep going. There we go. This is a really neat picture. I was at the site roughly where this was taken. After the war, these guys, the 17th, I should mention at this point, Josiah and most of the men of the 17th, after 3 years, opted not to re-enlist. Those of you who are familiar with the war know that there was a big effort in 1864 for the guys who had enlisted in April and May. Their time was now up. Of course, it was a problematic time. Grant had taken over, largely taken over the Eastern armies, even though Meade remained nominal command of the Army of the Potomac. But all of the men who had fought through the Eastern campaigns as well as the Western campaigns, battles like Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, etc., their time was coming up, they were done, 3 years. So the Army said, geez, we got to keep these guys. These are the veterans, these are the guys who know what they're doing out here. So there was a huge attempt to get them to stay. They were offered furloughs back home, they were offered bounties. If a certain number of your men, of your unit stayed, you got to be a veteran unit. And interestingly, I found some, they also made other attempts. In fact, one guy who I found, he was not in the 17th, but I think he spoke for a lot of them when he opted not to continue. His comment was that lager beer has lost its allure. They were attempting to get these guys liquored up, get them to sign and stay for the duration of the war. And so I'll talk a little bit at the end, a little bit more about that 1864, but most of Josiah's company, most of Josiah's regiment did not re-up. And the book gets into a lot of detail about some of their thoughts about why, etc. And it's an interesting thought, and one that I hadn't kicked around too much, about these guys who came home after 3 years. This is a reunion picture. I believe it's 1887. And there's Josiah in the back. This is in Peoria. I've been to this park here. This is another guy he served with, Robert Campbell, who shows up in some of his writings. And this is an interesting story right here. People say, well, why is there a woman sitting in front? That is a woman named Belle Reynolds. And she was described in one of Josiah's letters. I saw this comment in his letter that said, the Lady Major is in camp. What, Lady Major? When the heck, at what point did the Union Army begin allowing women in and commissioning as majors in the regular army? It turns out her husband was Lieutenant William Reynolds of the 17th Illinois. I think he was Company A. She was with him and accompanied him on some of his, when he was in the service. After the first day of Shiloh, many of you know the Union Army was largely routed, pushed all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing, and stabilized finally by Buell's men coming in. They reattacked the next day. But that first day was chaos for the Union Army. They were surprised. They had green troops in the first line that were hit and overwhelmed, including some of the men of Sherman's units. And she allegedly, when the men got pushed all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing, helped stabilize, treat some of the wounded, etc. So Governor Yates of Illinois was down visiting at some point after that, and somebody said, geez, you should, well, that Belle Reynolds, she was tremendous that day. It was described to him what had happened. And he said something to the effect of, well, I believe I should give her a commission in the Army. And someone said, well, her husband's already an officer. And Yates's comment was, what rank is her husband? You know, he's a lieutenant. Well, he said something effective, I believe in giving women the better of it, so you are now a major. So she became the Lady Major, which I had never heard of before, but that's Major Belle Reynolds. This is the Josiah Moore family, and I believe it's about 1890, 92. Josiah and Jenny, their 4 children. And again, you can tell that they've done fairly well. Josiah went back to school, finished his undergrad degree, stayed at Monmouth. In fact, it's interesting. I mean, almost within weeks of coming out of the Army in 1864, he left Jenny again, even though he'd only been home 2 or 3 times, got his degree, stayed, became an ordained Presbyterian minister, and served in various postings throughout Illinois. In fact, it was interesting driving through there, seeing all these places where Josiah was posted during his life after war. This is Josiah and Jenny's great-grandson. An interesting story about them. About 2 years after I bought the letters, I had an email from the guy I bought the letters from. He said, hey, I had a little interesting thing that happened to me. He said, I was contacted by a guy named David Shoop. That's David Shoop on the left, obviously, his wife Liz. And he said, he called me and he said, hey, I really enjoyed, as a kid, going up to the cabin. Hey, whatever happened to all those Civil War letters that used to be there? So, my friend Bob had to say, well, I kind of sold them. And the reason Bob sold them, which I should mention, is it was his, I have to get this right, because Bob had to correct me before. It was his aunt's husband's side of the family, so not a blood relation. And I even said to Bob, don't you want to keep these? He goes, it's not blood relation, not mine, so I'd like to get rid of them. He was a blood relation. David was the great-grandson of Josiah and Jenny. So he asked him about it, and he said, how do you want me to handle it? I went, oh, geez. Well, he wasn't really happy when he found that out. But he was a little happier when he found out that I was doing something with him. So David and I actually got to be pretty good friends. I visited him. This picture was taken 8 years ago, in 2008, when I visited their house in suburban Chicago. He was tremendously helpful to me. He provided me a lot of information about family history, such that when I read these letters and I saw a name in there, I said, oh yeah, that's Jenny's cousin, or that's Josiah's brother, and I knew who everybody was. The reason they're sitting on this is, family legend is, that's the love seat on which Josiah proposed to Jenny. So, I asked them if they would sit in that when I visited with them. Now, he was really caught up in this project. David died last October. He never saw the book done. It's one of the things that I really regret about this. He had severe Alzheimer's before he died. His wife was, he kept hanging on, trying to get in, but he passed away in October, unfortunately. So, and I did it again. I missed Josiah's. Anyway, there was Josiah's headstone there.
You want to go back?
Let me go back again. There it is. This is headstone for Josiah. It is in a cemetery in Peoria. It's really kind of solitary, which is interesting. Jenny is buried in suburban Chicago, and I'm not quite sure why, as I say in the book, why these two people who were so close in life are buried so far apart. There are some Lindsays. I believe it's not even, I don't think it's Jenny's mom who's there. There are some Lindsays that are kind of close by. All their kids, I believe, are in suburban Chicago. The only one who's close is Jenny's sister Maggie, who she was very close to, who died in 1865. She's the only one who's there. So this sits down, this is all that's on there. Captain Company F, 17th Illinois Infantry, 1833-1897. So it's interesting that Josiah, who was from Monmouth, is buried in Peoria, and Jenny, who's from Peoria, is buried outside Chicago. So let's just real quick, because I know we want to allow some time for questions,
Right.
I think. Just a couple quick things, because I do want to hear what you guys have to say. As I went through some of this research, I found a number of things that were interesting to me, that kind of, and the reason I call it Things I Thought I Knew About the Civil War, because the real title would have been Things I Thought I Knew, Things I Was Wrong About, and Things I Never Thought Much About the Civil War, but that title is too long. So there's some interesting things that I found out about this as well. And I just wanted to flip through a couple of those rather quickly. The one that I referenced earlier, that I kind of thought I knew, but kind of reinforced, that when men joined the Union Army at the beginning of the war, in the overwhelming majority, it wasn't to end slavery. It was to keep the Union together. That was the overriding thought of it. So that was, now we'll go on to the second one real quick. Either my thumbs are too large or something.
You want me to go back?
No, that's okay. We'll just go through with this. There was some truth to this, but the reality is, as I found out, I hadn't fully realized how much other countries wanted this great democracy, this great Republican experiment to fail. Great Britain, France, Germany desperately wanted this to be done. In fact, there's a quote from from this aristocrat in Great Britain who said, "Power in the hands of the masses throws the scum of the community to the surface, and truth and justice are soon banished from the land." A French visitor told his friend, he said, "Oh, you guys are done with. There's going to be huge riots in the street. You'll have 3 monarchies, and then we'll see what happens." That was the other reason. Yeah, Great Britain needed cotton, but they also wanted to see this country fail desperately. Assumption that I knew a little bit about Copperheads, but I did a lot more research on it. People in the North were solidly behind the war effort. No, not really. In fact, there was the mayor of the city of New York had proposed that New York City remain neutral because, geez, we do commerce with both. Let's just stay out of the war. So they clearly were not fully supportive. A Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice said, "Why don't we redraw the Mason-Dixon line and draw the Mason-Dixon line in New York?" A Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice said that. Yates, who was the governor of Illinois, talked about the fact of how deep secession was. In Illinois itself, which I get into in the book, Peoria was kind of the dividing line. It was a mixture of North and South sentiments. Southern Illinois was very much pro-secession, pro-Southern. In fact, there's some places who argued to secede from the Union there, largely because a lot of Southern Illinois contained people who had migrated in from states like Kentucky and Tennessee. The northern part was largely immigrants who were solidly pro-Union, and therefore Yates had some real problems. In fact, at one point, particularly in 1863, with people like John Lindsay trying to pour liquid hell down Abraham Lincoln's throat, he received permission from Lincoln to station 2 regiments of infantry in the streets of Springfield, the capital of Illinois, because he was so worried about some type of revolutionary activities or overthrow. It was a very dangerous time in those states as well. Ambivalence on the war largely confined to border states. No, I knew there was some ambivalence. We always knew that Maryland, Missouri, etc. were problematic, but if you drive about an hour north of here, I discovered a place that was called the Fishing Creek Confederacy up outside Bloomsburg, where deserters, Southern sympathizers went. They sent some troops in to clean it out. A Union officer was killed, at which point they sent in more troops, rounded up the conspirators, and shipped them off to Fort Mifflin in Philadelphia. So, if you think that it was only Maryland and Missouri, it was not. Pennsylvania was part of that as well. Keeps jumping. Okay. Let's see which one that was. Actions of Sherman's men quickly, and the book gets into a lot of this. We always make these assumptions that Sherman's men, it's a shame what happened, it was an aberration. It wasn't. Significant amounts of those types of activities happened as early as I could find, 1862, for some of the men stationed in central Tennessee. So it was really not an aberration. The fall of 1862 was a really difficult time. Let me see if I can. There was another one. I talked a little bit about the guys in 1864. I hadn't thought much about this. These guys who came back in 1865, when the war was over, there was a huge parade through downtown Washington, the Grand Review. Army of the Potomac marched on day 1. Sherman's men marched on day 2. One, because there were a lot on each side. The other part was they hated each other so much they had to keep them separate because they literally got into fistfights when they were both camped in the Washington area. But I didn't think much about, what about the guys in '64 who came back? We couldn't celebrate, couldn't have these great celebrations, great parades, because there were still thousands of men dying on Grant's Overland Campaign, Sherman going through Georgia. So I never thought much about these poor guys who came back, who had done their job, been out for 3 years, gone through some horrific battles, and it was, other than the families greeting them, and allegedly some minor celebrations on the 4th of July, that they really didn't get their due, because they didn't get to march by and large in the Grand Review as well. So it's kind of, we kind of overlooked some of those guys, unfortunately. Some of the other issues, there was, and I think there's more scholarship on this coming out now, We made the assumption that these guys all came back, they reintegrated into society, everything was wonderful. In fact, what we now know is post-traumatic stress syndrome was significant in men of the war, which makes sense when you think about how we put together companies, how we put together units. Now, a company of men in the Civil War is about 100 men. Take 10 companies to make a regiment, that's about 1,000. 3, 4 regiments to make a brigade, etc. But when you put together a company, it was people from the same town. So it's unlike today when you might get thrown next to a guy from Nebraska and somebody else from Florida. When you went into war, in the Civil War, you were literally going into war with your next door neighbor, your coworker, perhaps your father, your brother, your uncle, in this case, a fellow student. So it's not uncommon to know that when these men would see these people they knew so well, perhaps family members, die in horrific manners, that they would have serious mental issues when they came out. Alcoholism was prevalent. There's these sad stories about men who would wander the towns of America just because they couldn't refocus. There were also instances which really shocked me when some people would refuse to hire veterans. They're thinking, hey, you know what? These guys killed people, they stole, I don't want them around me. Some employers would absolutely refuse to hire some of these men. And some people literally, and there was a quote from one veteran, he said, boys, let's face it, people back home are afraid of us. They'd seen some horrific things and they were wondering and worried about what they would do. So it didn't work out well for many of them. In fact, one of the quotes I saw that just had me shaking my head, there was one man who had significant problems, and he said, I've had Shiloh since the 6th day of April 1862. He viewed Shiloh as a disease that he could never shake again. This was the other thing, you're all familiar with the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and I had always, of course we all follow stuff, some people collect it. GAR immediately became this post-war force and men joined it. Nothing was further from the truth. It had only 30,000 members in 1865. The GAR was kind of largely the VFW for Civil War veterans. Had only 30,000 members in 1865. A lot of these guys had no interest in revisiting the horrible things they had gone through. They had reduced the standing army again. The U.S. went from 1 million men in uniform at the end of the war to 54,000 in 1866, and then down to 27,000 in 1876. And the GR itself wasn't that well received. I was shocked, and this had to be particularly galling for Josiah as a member of the Presbyterian faith and ordained minister. It's a segment of the Presbyterian Church in Iowa that declared the GAR to be inconsistent with the principles of the United Presbyterian Church because of its dangerous and unworthy officers, extrajudicial oaths, and secretive meetings and selfishness. So it had to be a bit of a shock for Josiah, unfortunately. The other thing, we all know that things didn't change significantly for the better for African Americans after the war. Legal slavery had ended, what we know about Jim Crow, etc., but I always kind of made the assumption that at least the guys who fought probably had a better time of it, and as I did my research, I found out that wasn't necessarily the case. What happened after the war, when they'd go to these reunions, and in fact I just showed Wayne a picture one that I picked up, they would have these reunions, and you saw the one on there, and as the U.S. changed from this idyllic agrarian society and entered more into the industrial age, you would have the Union and Confederate veterans began to come more and more together, reflecting back on what they had before they went. And it was truly unfortunate because you actually saw the Union and Confederate, it wasn't unfortunate they got together, but in many cases got together to the exclusion of some of the black veterans who had fought and fought well for the United States during that period of time. And finally, let me close with this, and then let me take some questions from you. I heard someone speak a few months ago. He was a professor, and someone brought up the view of U.S. exceptionalism, and I touched on that, about why men fought at the beginning of the war, and they fought for union. And unfortunately, most did not fight to free African Americans, but as the war went on, they saw, if not the moral need to do it, they at least saw the pragmatic wisdom of taking away that free labor force from the South. But this professor really U.S. just kind of shrugged, and I was disturbed by that. And as I did my research, I came across a great quote that in my view does show why we're exceptional, that the founding of this country was founded on exceptional ideas, and it was a great quote from an Irish recruit who joined the Union Army, and this is what he said, and this is why he joined. He said, "This is my country as much as the man that was born on the field." He realized that if the Union loses, then, quote, "the hopes of millions fall. The old cry will be sent from the aristocrats of Europe," such as the one I told you about earlier, "that such is the common end of all republics." In my view, that's why we're exceptional, and that was one of the outcomes of the war. So with that, let me